So I've been talking a lot about the good things that come out of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, people being able to get access to cheaper medicine, to better clothing, to new kinds of food. That's all great. People getting new opportunities, being able to just have better lives. That's awesome. But as a historian, I have to stress that when you have broad changes, while they can benefit some people, they can hurt other people. So there's also problems that are going to rise out of the Industrial Revolution. And there will be new ideas, particularly political and economic ideas, for how to respond to those problems. So first of all, we need to talk about the problems. So here's the thing. Capitalist competition means that businesses must pay workers as little as possible to maximize profit. And if they don't, they will go bankrupt. Right? So remember we talked about how in capitalism, you have this idea that the capitalist and the capitalist is the person who owns the means of production, who owns the capital. There's this idea that they are taking a risk because if they, if they invest in a bakery and the bakery doesn't make any money, it goes bankrupt and then they lose their capital. And because they take the risk, they get the reward, they get the profit. And they naturally then want to keep costs down in order to maximize their profit. So one cost when you're baking bread, for example, or you have a factory, is the cost of the wages of your workers, right? So if you want to maximize your profits, you want to pay your workers as little as possible. And to give you a concrete example of this, I used to work at, I won't say the restaurant, but when I was in college, I worked at a restaurant. And I was always frustrated because as soon as we had enough people to do the job properly, I was a dishwasher at the restaurant. As soon as we had enough people to actually do the job properly, they would send someone home. And I've talked to students, and I guess that kind of thing still goes on today. The reason that they will send someone home is so that they can save money. Someone who's sent home isn't being paid anymore, and they want to squeeze the workers for as much as they can so they can make money, because the less workers there are, the less wages they pay, the higher the profits are. Now, I don't like that, especially I don't like it when people do that to our students, and then the students don't have time to study and then don't do well in their classes and lose scholarships and things like that. That's my little rant. But to continue, you may say to yourself, well, I would have been a nice factory owner. I would have been a factory owner who would have paid my workers well, and that is very noble, and I certainly respect that motivation. But here's the problem with capitalism. The problem with capitalism is if you try and be a nice person like that, you might just go out of business. So let's say that that you are a nice person and you're going to pay your workers $5 an hour to work in a factory. I'm just making up numbers. But then there's someone else down the road who is only going to pay their workers $4 an hour. Now, the problem is this. Let's say you make an identical product in terms of quality. Let's say you both make t-shirts, you make the same quality of t-shirts. That person is only paying $4 an hour. You're paying $5 an hour. So that means that person can sell their t-shirts cheaper than you can. People will buy their shirts. They will not buy your shirts because your shirts are more expensive and you will be out of business. So this is one of the fundamental problems with capitalism, and it's why we have minimum wage laws. Is because, in a sense, even if you're a nice capitalist, the system pressures you to pay workers as little as possible so that you can survive. Because the problem is if you're nice, you will go out of business because someone else who's not so nice, because of the competition, is going to pay the workers very little, will make this identical product as you in terms of quality. That product will be cheaper, so people will buy it. They won't buy your product. You will go out of business. So because of this, entire families, including children, might have to work in order to survive, right? Because they're going to be paid very low wages. In addition, in order to keep down costs, conditions will often be, in factories, will be often unsafe, right? Safety measures cost money, and being safe often takes more time. right? If you say, well, to be safe, we have to stop the machine every 2 hours to clean these parts. Well, when the machine is stopped and the workers are cleaning it rather than making more stuff, that costs you money. It reduces efficiency. So the conditions for the workers are often unsafe. In addition, to save money, and you can kind of see this in this image here on the right, factories oftentimes will just dump pollution out. So for example, in England, in London, the city of London, the Thames River became extraordinarily dirty because factories would just dump their pollution directly into the river without treating it or doing anything like that. Because it would just cost money. It was to treat it well. So this caused environmental problems. So these are some very serious issues. These are some very serious problems, right? People are being paid low wages. Whole families are having to work. And of course, children who are working are not in school. So and like I said, they're often working under unsafe conditions. They can be easily injured or even killed. And this is polluting the environment. There's lots and lots of problems. And what's really striking is even though you've got people like the bourgeoisie becoming wealthier, real wages for workers do not begin to rise until 1850. And the Industrial Revolution has been under effect in a sense for several decades by that time. But workers aren't making that much money. So you have massive profits being made by these factories. But for a long time, it's not getting to the workers, right? So some people, the capitalists, and in particular, to a certain extent, the bourgeoisie, are becoming very wealthy, while these poor workers who are creating the wealth are not receiving a share in it, right? So this is a major series of problems that the industrial societies have to face. So people are going to react to these problems in a variety of ways. One way, for example, will be through charity, right? People are poor. We're supposed to help them. In particular, church groups are very active because, the Bible says clearly, love your neighbor. Jesus talks a lot about feeding the poor, feeding the hungry, things like that. So you would have church charitable organizations, but there's a couple problems with that. The first problem is they just could never offer enough aid. There were so many poor people suffering that as much as churches tried to help, it wasn't enough. The second problem is this. Even if you help these poor people, the system that helped make and keep them poor, this system where workers were squeezed to get as much labor as possible from them while paying them as little as possible, that system still is there. It's just going to create more poor people, right? So charity is kind of a Band-Aid. It does help, and I'm certainly not being critical of charity at all. But my point is, in this time period, there simply wasn't enough charity to help all the poor. And in addition, charity didn't deal with the root problem. It didn't deal with why these people were poor. The fundamental problem being that workers are being squeezed to get as much as possible out of them while paying them as little as possible. And the working poor, or just people who would like to work but couldn't get jobs, who come to the cities in hopes of finding the jobs but weren't able to get them for whatever reason, they could cause social problems themselves, right? They might riot, they might protest, they might turn to crime. So another response to these problems is control. It's interesting that it's in the 19th century that we first get uniformed police forces, right? So going along with the Industrial Revolution is this development in police, which is basically developing in order to control these poor people and to prevent them from causing problems. And again, while that can help keep social order, it does precious little to actually help these poor people or solve the fundamental problems of society. And again, I want to stress, I'm not criticizing the police force. We certainly need police. My point, though, is that in this time period, right, the poor are seen oftentimes as a threat when they try and react to these problems that they face, right? This fact that, like I said, they're being paid very little if they can find work, even though they're the ones that are helping create a huge amount of wealth for society. right? So there's this idea, okay, if we can't fix these poor people, let's control them to stop them from threatening society. So then, if we're in this situation where you've got these problems and charity isn't doing enough and not dealing with the fundamental problems, and this idea of just trying to control things, again, doesn't deal with the fundamental problems, how can we try and fix things? Right? There's going to be a lot of people who try and fix this basic situation. And I like this comic on the right because I think it shows that, is you have the wealthy capitalist, the owner of the factory, who kind of controls the world, being supported by this little factory girl. Right? How do we deal with this problem? This little girl should not be having to carry the burden of the worker, or the burden of the factory owner, the capitalist, the burden of the whole world on her shoulders. How do we deal with this fundamental problem where people who were helping to create so much wealth aren't really receiving it? Well, sometimes people just try and work within the system, right? Let's keep the basic system. Let's extend voting rights. Let's allow more and more people to have the right to vote. And if they have the right to vote, politicians in a democratic society have to respond to what they want because they want to keep getting elected. So if we say gave more workers the right to vote or something like that, if we do that, then they will have a say in the government and people will have to listen to them, and will pass laws like, say, minimum wage laws, or laws that limit how long you can work, or laws that make it so children cannot work. That would help them. A related idea would be to form unions, trade unions, where people would engage in collective bargaining to improve their situation. So, if I try and negotiate my how much I'm paid per hour with my boss, I'm probably going to lose if I do that individually. Or he'll just say, well, that's just company policy. And if I protest too much, my boss will just fire me. But if 1,000 workers at a factory work together and bargain collectively and say, hey, you need to pay all of us more, or we're going to strike, or we're not going to work, or something like that, then you could have some change, right? That's much harder to deal with. How do you deal with 1,000 workers? And this is, unfortunately, is why unions were often resisted violently by factory owners. They would call in thugs to beat up unionists and things like that. But unions are still basically working within the system. It's just arguing that you should have a right to bargain collectively instead of individually with your boss, and that way earn more money. And sometimes these unions could get quite big and wouldn't just be within a single factory, but would encompass a whole profession. Some people will become more radical and just question the whole idea of capitalism itself. So they would say, here's the problem. In capitalism, the profit goes to the owner who is a private owner, right? This is my factory. I'm going to run it how I want to run it, and I get the profit. So why don't we change the way we own things? Instead of having a factory that is owned privately, that the profits of which go to those individuals or the corporation that owns it, why don't we have the community own it? Or why don't we have the state own it? Because if we do that, that will solve this problem of profit, so that instead of being managed to enrich a single owner or the corporation, the factory will be managed to help the community. We manage to help the workers, and we manage to help the whole government. Right? So, you've got this problem where workers are being paid very little to maximize the profits of capitalists, because and even if you're a nice capitalist, you have to pay the workers very little so you don't go out of business. What if the government ran the factory? The government doesn't need to worry about going out of business. It can run the factory in a way that is fair to the workers and that gives them a share of the wealth and that treats them decently, right? Because it doesn't have to worry about profits. It can worry about the well-being of the workers. Or does it have to even be a government? Maybe it should be the local community. And to give you an idea of this, one thing I like to give as an example of socialism is, in a sense, is the Green Bay Packers. Right? The Packers are a great football team. Green Bay is not a huge city. The Green Bay Packers could move to another place and make more money, but the Green Bay Packers are actually owned by the city of Green Bay, in a sense, right? It's very complex how the ownership works, but it's not simply a private sports team that could get up and move to another city if it wanted to. And that's kind of an example of socialism, right? So the Green Bay Packers stays in Green Bay because it's owned by the people of Green Bay, And they want it to operate not necessarily in a way that will produce the most profits, which would mean moving to another city, but in a way that benefits their community. That's the fundamental idea of socialism, is the idea of having social group ownership of important properties like factories. Some people, and socialism, I want to stress, is pretty darn radical, but some people don't think that these measures are radical enough. So this next part is going to be a little complex, because this is going to kind of introduce a way of thinking that maybe people are not so familiar with. However, and we're going to be talking about communism, I have to stress, throughout the rest of this course, I'm going to continuously refer back to communism. So it's very important that you understand the basic ideas of communism. Now, communism was in a sense founded by Karl Marx, as well as a man named Friedrich Engels, but we're going to mostly focus on Karl Marx. Remember how earlier we were talking about how people like Adam Smith were inspired by the discoveries of natural scientists who were studying things like astronomy and wanted to try and apply science to the understanding of human behavior. In Adam Smith, it was the economy, right? He said, I want to discover the economic laws that govern human behavior so we can take action to organize our economy in a more rational, efficient way to benefit people. Karl Marx thinks in a kind of a similar way. He wants to study history to find the scientific laws that drive history. He understood history as a science, and that human behavior over historical time is driven by scientific laws. And what he argued is that the force that drives history is the economy. He argued that the fundamental force that drives history is the economy. And I want to stress that's a little bit different from people like me. For example, remember I study, one of my specialties is religious history. I argue that ideas are important in understanding history. Now, I also think the economy is important. But Marx would look at me and say, Dr. Rausch, clearly ideas are created by economic need. So ideas themselves are not important from Karl Marx's perspective in a sense. It's the economy that drives history because the economy is fundamentally behind ideas. Marx also believed that he was what we would call a materialist, and I don't mean like he was materialistic, like he wanted to just buy like a Corvette and have fancy clothes. What I mean is that he thought only matter exists. He believed in this kind of materialism that only matter exists. So because of this, he was also an atheist. He rejected religion. He saw religion as a reflection of economic problems in a sense. And he saw religion as what he would call the opiate of the masses. An opiate is a kind of medicine or drug that makes you sleepy and kind of drowsy. And he would argue that religion kind of puts people to sleep, telling them that they should just suffer in this life so they can have a better afterlife. And it would be much better if those people woke up and worked to make changes so they can benefit in this life. But all that being said, Marx understood himself as discovering the scientific laws that drive history, and that it's principally the laws of the economy that drives history. And so when he divided up history, he argued that societies progressed through particular economic stages, right? So he divided basically history into different stages. So remember how we talked about like Chinese history, and they divided it into dynasties where you had a different family ruling China, and when you changed families, you had a new dynasty. That's how Chinese traditionally did history. Divided it up. He divided it up through economic stages. And what made one economic stage different from a previous economic stage was a different kind of class conflict. So Marx understood history as being driven by conflict, particularly different conflict between different economic classes of people. And what differentiated these economic classes was who owned the means of production, who owned capital, right? So there were two classes that are in conflict with each other. And the difference between them is one is the oppressor who owns the means of production. The other is the oppressed, right? So in Marx had this kind of simple idea of how, I shouldn't say simple, he wrote thousands of pages, but we can boil it down to a kind of simple idea that history is marked by conflict between economic classes in which one is the owner of the capital, the means of production. One is the person who doesn't own anything or owns very little. So, for example, and I'm oversimplifying things, but Marx argued that one of the earliest stages of human history was slavery, where the oppressors owned slaves, and slaves were the capital, they were the means of production, and of course the oppressed were the slaves themselves. Eventually, according to Marx, there was a development so that there was a shift to feudalism. In feudalism, the oppressors own the land, the capital, the means of production is the land, and the oppressed, or the serfs, were the peasants that were forced to work the land for them. Right? In the current time period that Marx understood himself as living in was a time of capitalism, in which the oppressors were the capitalists who owned the means of production, which were the factories and the machines, and the oppressed were the workers who worked in those factories or on those machines. So Marx believed that people had gone through these two stages, first slavery and feudalism, and were now in this stage of capitalism, which is the time that he lived in. And he believed that eventually, though, human beings would move from capitalism to communism, which would be a perfect society in which class conflict had disappeared because of the victory of the oppressed people. Right? He believed the oppressed people, in this case the workers, what he would call the proletariat, would eventually seize power and create a kind of classless society in which everything would be perfect. So what would this kind of communist utopia look like? Right? What would it be like? What would it be like to live in a communist society? What's going to happen after capitalism? Well, first of all, and this is what's kind of tricky, is I have to ask you to, if you know this stuff, to kind of unlearn something. So pretty much every communist government that was ever established became this like all-powerful state that told people what to do, and if they didn't want to do it, could like kill them. So when you think of when communism actually developed, it was, like I said, it led to these very powerful governments that basically oppressed their people and told them what to do. But that's not what Karl Marx thought should happen in the end. So I want to stress here, I'm not talking about what actually happens. I'm going to talk about the ideal. And that's important because who would support a government that's going to take all your freedom away, right? No one's going to support that, except for maybe the government. That's what happened, but that's not what Marx wanted to happen in the end. So if we want to understand why communism was so popular, why so many people would believe it and support the development of communist countries, we have to understand what was attractive about it. So Marx argued that in the end, the ideal, there would be no private property. Everyone would share all the goods evenly. And the communists express this in this idea: from each according to ability, to each according to need. From each according to ability, to each according to need. Basically, you're going to do the best you can, give as much as you can, and then you will get whatever you need. So in the communist utopia, there will be no private property, goods will be shared evenly. So everyone will get enough stuff. Everyone will get enough stuff. If you're a poor worker who's barely scraping by, whose whole family has to work simply so you can survive, and you live in a society, though, where there's other people, the bourgeoisie and capitalists, who are by comparison fabulously wealthy, this is a very attractive idea. You know, there's these people in this world who have more than enough. There's people who don't have even close to enough. Wouldn't it be nice if we shared and everyone had enough stuff? That's an attractive idea. That's probably an attractive idea even to you now. Think about it if you were that poor, how attractive that would be. In addition, one thing we have to stress as well is that the communists believed that all conflict is inherently economic. So again, remember, I'm a historian of religion, and I teach about the Protestant Reformation. When I teach about the Protestant Reformation, I teach about ideas. But communists would say, oh no, those ideas, those religious ideas aren't really about religion. They're the reflection of economic problems. So whereas I would say, okay, this person believed this way and this person believed that way, and that's why there was conflict, they would say, no, the reason why they believed in those ways was because of different economic issues. And if you look deeply enough, you can find the economic issues driving that religious conflict. So here's the thing. Communists thought all conflict arose out of economics, out of class issues. Well, if everyone has enough stuff, if we get rid of private property and people share everything evenly and everyone gets enough stuff, there will be no more conflict. If there's no more conflict, why do we need a government? If there's no more conflict, what do we need a government for? If everyone just kind of agrees, we don't need lawyers to settle issues. If everyone agrees and everyone has enough stuff, we don't need people to arrest thieves. So we don't need any government. So once we get rid of this class conflict, once we make sure that there is no private property, once we make sure everyone gets enough stuff, there won't be any conflict. We don't need a government anymore. The government will just disappear. This is what I mean. This is the ideal. The ideal was not to have an all-powerful government that would tell everyone what to do and oppress them. The ideal was eventually you would have no government. There would be no more exploitation. And so when you put this all together, the idea is everyone would have enough stuff that they could enjoy in perfect freedom. Now, isn't that an attractive idea? Imagine living in a system where you had everything you need, as well as some stuff you wanted, and the perfect freedom to enjoy it. Isn't that great? That's what was so attractive about communism. It promised to overcome a terrible situation. Many people were suffering in this capitalist world, especially in the first half of the 19th century. And communism promised them that not only would they have enough stuff to survive, they would be able to have the freedom to enjoy it. Wouldn't that be great? What more could you ask for in this world than what you need, a little bit of what you would like, and the freedom to enjoy it? That was the ideal. How are we going to get there? Well, Marx predicted that the workers would be pushed so far by the capitalist search for profits that they would eventually rebel. Remember, the workers are being squeezed. They're being squeezed tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter to get as much work out of them while paying them as little as possible. If you push them far enough, Marx thought they would eventually rebel. And therefore, Marx predicted that the communist revolution would happen first in the most industrialized countries. He thought it would happen in Britain first. It was the most industrialized country. It was the country where the workers were being pushed really far. So that it's logical that they would rebel first. And once they did, then they would establish this communist utopia where there was no private property, where everyone got enough stuff. So therefore, they didn't need a state. So therefore, they would have perfect freedom as well as having enough stuff. And I want to highlight this image on the right. This is kind of a basic ideal communist view. The German there says, "Workers of the world unite." And the whole phrase is typically, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." And you can see there's this image of workers of different races and ethnicities uniting together. Right? In communism, the primary identity is class. And this is understood to be more important than race or ethnicity. So to kind of continue, if we look at this image on the right, this is a kind of French-English kind of example of communist propaganda. And you see on the bottom, you see the poor workers, and they're being oppressed because they have to support the rich, right? And you can maybe see, if you're looking at a big enough screen, between the workers and those wealthy people on the bottom, it says, "Making the rich even richer and ourselves only poorer." And above them, you have this kind of system of oppression, right? On top, you have the kings. It says, "We rule you." The kings are supported by religious figures, and they're trying to be, in a sense, fair in their criticism. On the left is a Catholic priest, in the middle is a Protestant minister, and the right is an Orthodox priest. And it says, "We fool you." Right? We trick you into accepting this terrible life in this world in hopes that you'll have a better life in the next. But remember, Marx was an atheist. He said there is no next life. This is it. So you might as well work to make this life better. And below the priests and the minister, if you don't accept them, if you're not fooled, you have the soldiers who will shoot you. Right? We shoot you. So this was basically, this kind of image gives you a sense of how communists understood the world, right? These workers are being oppressed to benefit the wealthy, but there's this whole system of power that keeps them, the workers oppressed, and that keeps the wealthy wealthy. So the key thing then is when you've got this violent system that is trying to trick you, and if it fails to trick you, is trying to kill you, all means are acceptable to get rid of it. The capitalists will never give up their power voluntarily. The rich will never voluntarily give up being rich. We're facing this violent system. It is right for us to be violent against it, right? It's right for us to be violent against it. All means are acceptable. And it's interesting to me that in 1848, that's the year that the Communist Manifesto will be delivered. That's the year of many revolutions, failed revolutions for the most part, in Europe. But this is the year that Marx, and this is when things are worst, pretty much at their worst for factory workers, the proletariat as Marx would call them. It's in that year that Marx issues his call for communism, right, in a very clear and evocative way, when things are, in a sense, at their worst. Now, one thing we have to stress, a lot of communism is going to depart from the ideas of Marx. Marx is wrong in some places in terms of what he thought would happen, but he really is the one who gets the ball rolling, in a sense. And also, he will help lead to the establishment of communist parties. Communist parties are extraordinarily important because they're highly organized, and they're the ones who are going to bring about some revolutions thanks to their organizational abilities and their discipline, right? There's kind of a joke, about, why is the, I don't talk a whole lot about them, but this is a time period when anarchism was also popular. But it sounds like a terrible joke, but the anarchists were poorly organized, and that's one reason why their ideas do not gain much traction. In comparison, the communists are extraordinarily well organized, extraordinarily well disciplined, and this allows them to successfully foment revolutions and to export revolution throughout the world. Right? So the communists are going to be extraordinarily important. We're going to keep coming back to them as this class proceeds. One thing, just so you understand, I'll talk more about this when we get to the Cold War. I am not a communist. I'm very much an anti-communist. But I do my best to explain why people would be attracted to communism. And I want to try and give you a fair understanding of its ideas. But do make sure you understand this, because we're going to be continuously referring back to it as this class continues.